Hello and welcome to the crux of medtech. We go beyond the buzzwords, bringing you the insights from the innovators, investors, and leaders who are driving this life-saving space forward. Because I'm absolutely fascinated by the stories that people have to tell in medtech. As someone who works in this sector on a daily basis, I come across so many interesting people and so many interesting stories that I think the world deserves to know about. Welcome to the crux of medtech.
So Ivan, welcome to the Crux of MedTech.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Right, it's a pleasure to have you here and to host you. So of course we know each other quite well, but for the audience, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure, yes. My name is Iwan van Vijfeijken. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm the current CEO of Microsure. I'm sure we'll come to talk about it some more. 59 years old, father of 3, married and happy.
Awesome. Very good. And so in the world of medtech, how did you get involved with the medtech industry in the first place?
Actually, it was about just over 15 years ago. Up until that point, I'd worked mostly in the corporate domain. Prior to starting in medtech, I was working for, at the time, NXP Semiconductors as a head of the strategy office, big company, corporates, big PowerPoints, big Excels, etc. And I really wanted to do something different. And so just so happened that via a friend of mine, I got the opportunity to start a business, really a startup in medtech. I did not have any medtech experience up until that point. But that was really attractive to me. So got started, was basically employee number one. Fast forward today with Microsure, it's my 4th medtech startup / scale-up company. So I've been through the ringer a few times.
Awesome. So what's the kind of differences between semiconductor and medtech? So the reason I'm asking this question is at the moment, I'm having a few conversations which suggest that medtech as an industry moves a lot slower than other industries, and semiconductors is one that's moved a lot faster. And some people feel like it's more of a cultural thing than necessarily something to do with the industry. But how do you feel that same thing within the medtech versus semiconductors, and how do you feel that change went for you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I would say semiconductors is not a fast business. It's really deep tech, right? And to design and manufacture a new chip is very expensive, and it takes years. And then after you develop it, you need to start selling it. And of course, by that time, the market will have changed, etc. So it is also a risky business. So I was used to that. I do like the deep tech component that is both in semiconductors, but also in medtech. I studied physics way back a long time ago, but I always have an appreciation for the ingenuity that goes into technology, the beauty of it. But also the effort it takes. So in that respect, semiconductors and medtech are not so different. However, medtech is much more regulated. And that's obviously, that slows down getting to a real business. Certainly with MDR, that has gotten not easier, on the contrary. So the whole regulatory aspect is definitely different. And so is, of course, the whole clinical aspect. You're having to deal with healthcare professionals, with hospitals, etc. So different enough for me to make it really interesting. And I haven't looked back since I left semiconductors.
Indeed. So for startups, there's, I'm sure, a ton of lessons in there. But just talk us through the journey of going through. So medtech startup number 1, employee number 1, starting to scale that. What happened in 2, 3, and 4?
Yes. Well, that's a whole longer story. But no, so the first one was in UV light therapy. A friend of mine, he said, hey, we have here a company, we'd like to basically create a daughter company. It was called Dermasun Medical. So in dermatology, was a new modality for UV light therapy. Basically a UV light you hang in the shower, and you have a short course of UV light therapy every day while you take a shower. And this is for people with chronic skin conditions. So think eczema, psoriasis, for example. And it was a new way of treating these patients, chronic conditions, and it was developing the device from the start. It was finding a manufacturing partner. It was obviously the regulatory clearance, clinical trials, but then going to market. Was still a small company when I left after 5 years. But I've been through the whole cycle from, like I said, the earliest beginning, the prototypes, helping to think with that, through to visiting hundreds and hundreds of dermatologists. So I was also chief of sales, etc., and marketing, as you do in a real small startup company. So I learned a lot. I set up the quality management system from scratch. And that has served me well because I've been able to use that in the other ventures.
Awesome. So then start at number 1, what goes on number 2, and go through those.
So the second venture was with another company also based in the Netherlands, and they had actually a very broad spectrum of products. We had some equipment for sterilization department in hospitals. We had an EMG device for pelvic dysfunction. We also make modules, subcomponents for Philips X-ray machines. And we had our own, very small, but nevertheless our own assembly or manufacturing facility. So that was new, and I learned a lot. The differences between developing, designing a medical device and actually fabricating it. And there is a big difference. And to be honest, I learned that this is a different competency altogether, with different people, different mentalities, you name it. And I'd rather not mix them, if I'm honest. So in my current venture, previous ones, I think I want to stay away from manufacturing because it's really a skill. Love to work with partners on that. Let's rely on other people who can do that, frankly, much better. And then I think we get the best out of both.
Understood. How did you learn that lesson?
Well, the hard way. So one of the things is we had a crew of people. We had, let's say, the professionals, and then we had the people in the assembly facility. The people in the assembly facility, they all start on time together and they end on time together, right? And then you have your engineers, and one might come in early and the other one a little bit later, etc. There's a lot more flexibility. And that created friction because the people in the assembly operation, they saw these other people, their colleagues, having a lot more freedom and flexibility. That's one thing. But also in manufacturing, people are very precise. They're very disciplined. I like that. But that's not always necessarily the case when you talk about engineering. So let's say what people would expect in terms of quality, repeatability, et cetera, is very different. And then, of course, you have a whole supply chain you need to manage. You have your whole your bill of materials, etc., different software packages, blah, blah, blah. So in short, a world of difference. And I think, if possible, keep them separate.
Sure. Understood. So let's move the story on to Microsure. So just give us a quick overview of what Microsure is building and what is the current motive of the company.
Yes. Yeah. So at Microsure, we're developing a microsurgical robot. And so it is robot-assisted surgery, however, very specifically for microsurgery, or to be more precise, open microsurgery. So we're talking about, as the word open suggests, a relatively shallow through the skin of the human being, and treating treating patients with instruments that a microsurgeon would use, your needle holder, your scissor, etc., but not going minimally invasive, which is, I think, what most people will associate when they think medical robotics, surgical robotics. We are not in that field at all of the minimally invasive surgery. And I would add immediately, thank God, because we all know there's one big player in there, Intuitive, hugely successful, and thank God we're not competing with them. So open microsurgery is operating at a very small scale. Think, for example, anastomosis of very small blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatic vessels. We're talking less than a millimeter in diameter. And to do that by hand becomes very, very challenging, even with a microscope. And that's where our robot comes in, our MUSA, that helps to for the surgeon to do these procedures, basically stitching with a needle and thread, but at a very, very small scale, and to do that with quality, with consistency. And a surgeon with a robot can do this not only on a given day, much longer, but also it stretches out the career, because as you know, with age, you get more wobbly, basically, and that's something you certainly cannot have in microsurgery.
Absolutely. So microsurgery does already exist. Why does it really need robotics? So you mentioned a couple of the challenges behind there, but what are the challenges surgeons are facing, and what are they kind of screaming out for robotics for?
Yeah, it has everything to do with the scale. So like I said, sub-millimeter vessels, you have to imagine you have to have a very tiny needle and thread. You need to make a small stitch with some knots, and then go around the perimeter of that very small vessel. If you go, say, to dimensions of 0.3 or even smaller diameter, this becomes extremely challenging, because every surgeon, every human being has their natural tremor. And at that scale, this becomes really a problem. To give you an idea, a very good trained microsurgeon will have a precision at the tip of the instrument of, say, about 100 micron, which is 0.1 millimeter, right? With a robot, you can go a factor of 10 more precise. And so there's an increasing need to work to perform microsurgery at that smaller scale, particularly in lymphatics. Lymphatic vessels are almost always very tiny, so very fiddly. The need for lymphatic surgery is growing. Think, for example, treatment of lymphedema, and swelling of the arms in particular, which is a very common chronic condition for women who have had breast amputation, and then also the lymphatic nodes having been removed. And as a result, the arm starts swelling. And this can be treated with a microsurgical procedure that involves the small lymphatic vessels, and that's where more and more you need your robot to help, because almost no surgeon can work at this scale by hand with quality throughout the day and throughout the years.
Okay, understood. So you also mentioned that this can go beyond where, I guess, the current limitations of the human hand even go. So connecting smaller and smaller vessels. You guys have quite an interesting approach. So just to kind of set the scene of microsurgery, there's obviously one player who's out on the market right now. There's you guys who have a clearance on a previous generation of the robot. There's two different approaches. There's one with a wristed instrument, and there's also one where the surgeon can use their own instrument. So go into a bit of detail about why you guys made the design choice to allow the surgeon to use their current instruments.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And in fact, only last week we had a founders event, the founders of Microsure, and the first CTO there. We asked him some questions. I said, how come that you guys at the time already made that choice? And he said, well, I was talking to surgeons, and and by the way, the first year of his 4-year PhD, the first year, the only thing he did was talking to surgeons to really understand what is the medical need. And he said, basically, what the surgeons told me was, these instruments I know and I trust. So what he said is, I actually built a robot around their instruments, which I thought was a very, a very sharp way of saying what he did. And we stuck with that principle. Start with the instruments that work, also at this small scale, and really build your robot around that. And we've made the choice indeed so to stick with that, but then also give that surgeon essentially the capability that the human arms have. They're fantastically versatile, right? The dexterity of human arms and hands is phenomenal. And surgeons really need that also with a robot, so that it feels as if they're operating the instruments in their own hands. And so that's what we mimicked. We really mimicked the architecture of our arms, the robot arms, we mimic the human arms. And indeed, you mentioned that the alternative is, and it really comes from minimally invasive surgery. Again, Intuitive having been one of the first ones, the most successful ones, but also our competitor has essentially copied that. I always call that the long chopsticks, with the wristed instruments at the end, very fine, beautifully articulated instruments. But it's fundamentally the long chopsticks that is the limiting factor to mimic, again, the dexterity of the human arms that surgeons are looking for. So we made a very fundamental choice in terms of the architecture, in terms of indeed bring your own tools, basically. And yeah, so we believe that will offer microsurgeons an alternative. And we believe that it has some intrinsic strength that will ultimately also, of course, help patients.
Understood. So I think microsurgery is a really interesting market because, as you mentioned, there's one very big player in a very big market in terms of laparoscopic, which is Intuitive. But this is really like a big blue ocean that lays out in front of microsurgery. There's no real kind of market at the moment. It's just you guys and the other player who have just early commercialization. So there's a big potential to kind of go to market, and there will be obviously competition, but it's a long way to go for robotics. So one of the biggest challenges we do have with robotics is the big learning curve on these big systems. So surgical robot like Intuitive, it takes weeks and months to actually get competent enough to start using the system on patients. So by making the design choice of non-wristed instruments, does that massively flatten the learning curve for surgeons? And if so, when they get it in their hands, how do they react?
Absolutely. There's been consistent feedback, and we've seen it in our offices when microsurgeons come to try out our system. And I'm not exaggerating, but within minutes, they're actually able to do an anastomosis on small synthetic vessels. And the feedback is always like, this feels so natural. It feels really easy because, the chopsticks with the wristed instrument is not human nature, right? So by mimicking the human arms, etc., the learning curve is very fast. And we see that also interesting facts that we see is that we see the learning curve is very steep for trained surgeons. We also have done some preclinical work with essentially medical students who have very basic surgery experience. And also for them, the learning curve is not only very fast, but it's approaching the level of consistency and speed, etc., quality that trained microsurgeons have. So you get if you like, a democratizing effect that with a robot, quote unquote, every microsurgeon can become a very good microsurgeon, can work at that small scale. And another way of saying the same thing is that surgeons tell us, they start with, say, a 2 millimeter vessel, and they end up with, say, 0.3 millimeter vessel, and they say, it feels the same. I don't feel a difference. Of course, because of the magnification, right? The tremor filtering, the scaling of the motion. So the challenge of going smaller and smaller is almost not there anymore, which is, I think, a beautiful thing to hear.
Okay, so by going smaller and smaller and extending human capability beyond what it is right now, what's this going to unlock for I guess, like new surgeries, new indications, increase in surgeries which weren't currently possible? What do you see that say?
So the general trend is to perform microsurgery at smaller scales, right? So I already mentioned lymphatics, but also say in free flaps or breast reconstruction, more and more the need is to connect smaller and smaller vessels. So that's one area, but that's still within plastic and reconstructive surgery. But also if you think about ENT surgery, head and neck, pediatrics, and of course neurosurgery, that's where scale really matters, and performing a very precise procedures with quality, reliability, etc., becomes extremely important. And then we're not only talking about anastomosis, but for example, also very small, precise dissections. So indeed, it opens up well beyond plastic and reconstructive surgery, enabling surgeons across a wide spectrum of specialities to become, one colleague of mine mentioned, it is the superpower of surgeons across the board for open microsurgery, that is to say.
Very cool. Very cool. So currently you guys are working towards CE marking and FDA clearance. But you've already got a CE marking on a previous version of the system. So can you just talk me through what the MUSA 2 versus the MUSA 3 and that story?
Yes, indeed. So we were actually the first on the market with a robot specifically for microsurgery. That was the MUSA 2. However, that device was not fit for purpose. What happened is, we developed a device, and this is then, let's say, what we call learning money, right? You learn by doing, you learn from your mistakes. We found out that even though we had a CE mark, it was not fit for purpose. It was clinically, we had very good results, but in the clinical practice, it wasn't good enough because it didn't have that dexterity that surgeons were expecting. So we had to basically go back to the drawing board. We did that about 4 or 5 years ago, and we did a complete redesign of the MUSA. And indeed, fast forward to today, we are on the cusp, indeed, of achieving CE certification next year, plus also later next year, FDA. So we are well on our way to enter the market with the MUSA 3, which frankly is a world of difference compared to the MUSA 2. I would say, though, that not all was in vain, because we did have very good clinical results, and indeed we're building on that. So it is a foundation. And of course, in hindsight, you would say, well, should have started with the MUSA 3, but that's not how life works always.
No, absolutely not. But I think it does also take quite a lot of discipline to not just go to market with a MUSA 2 and try and please what I'm sure investors would be looking for, which is you need to get to revenue as quickly as possible. It takes a lot of discipline to go backwards and say, actually, let's not go to market with something which isn't perfect. Let's redesign this and make sure that it's a market fit. And therefore, you have the better long-term results. But it's also different when you have pressures from a board or pressures from the market even to say, hey, we want to get this tech in our hands.
Yeah. No, absolutely right. And it was a bold and brave decision to go back to the drawing board. I have a lot of respect for that. It did hurt at the time for all concerned. But I think that what we would have found is that even if, let's say, you push systems into the market, ultimately the proof is not how many systems are in the market, but the utilization.
Yeah.
And so that is the utilization ultimately is the proof that the surgeon in a clinical practice, they really want to use it because it helps them, right? And so you got to have a good device that works, that is, for lack of a better word, intuitive, right? Which we have, but also that makes economic sense, because that's the other thing with surgical robotics in general, but also true for us, is that the economics for a hospital of a robot are not so simple. Let's face it, it is more expensive than doing procedures by hand.
I'm interrupting this episode to bring you a word from our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical technology development with deep scientific and engineering expertise. They support ambitious medtech companies in solving high-risk, high-complexity challenges where there's no margin for error. Whether you're tackling uncharted technical territory or racing to bring a product to market, TTP provide clarity and direction. By de-risking innovation and ensuring seamless alignment with regulatory and manufacturing demands, TTP help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes.
And how are you trying to bring down the cost of robotics? So you just mentioned that cost is a big barrier to it. What is Microsure doing to make sure it's as cost effective as possible?
Yeah. So the big thing, again, is related to that choice that the surgeons can use and reuse their own instruments, because these instruments are being reprocessed, right, in the sterilization department, and they come back. And that saves a huge amount of money, variable cost for the hospital, because it means that we don't need to supply basically one-off single-use set of instruments. that makes the economics for the hospitals, for the surgeons, a lot more attractive. And so that choice of giving surgeons comfort, what I said in the beginning, from the early days, let them use the instruments that they know and trust, has also a huge benefit for the economics. And we're very confident that will drive utilization in a positive way. And that's what we're also telling our customers in the future, that this is actually a good deal also for the hospital. As you know, in healthcare in general, but certainly also in surgery, you have to bring benefits to the patient, to the surgeons or the doctors, as well as to the hospitals, or at least the healthcare economic system. And we're doing all of that.
Awesome. So Microsure was your first venture into surgical robotics. So coming from other medtech worlds, what have you noticed as the biggest differences or the biggest learnings since stepping into a surgical robotics company?
Yes, so I have been in capital equipment, but nothing like the numbers we're talking here, right? And nothing like the kilograms we're talking here, because these are fairly big and heavy machines, right? Before I joined Microsure, I was basically in the wearables business, cardiac monitoring, so a small wearable on the skin. So you're talking a completely different device. So the scale of the device was definitely challenging. But then the biggest thing is we're talking about ultra high precision mechatronics. So that is the combination of mechanics, right, and electronics, a combination of hardware and software, because that tip of the instrument needs to be controlled in a very, very precise way. We're talking about sub 10 microns precision, which is extremely precise. At the same time, it needs to be very flexible. It needs to, sometimes I say it needs to, be as solid as an elephant, but still can dance. And that is the challenge. And that's where, technically speaking, we've been now working on this concept, the MUSA concept, for 15 years, really. This is not simple. If this was simple, this would not have taken 15 years. We've achieved it. We can deliver that precision and that dexterity, but it is a lot of complicated trade-offs, again, between, let's say, the hardware physics of springs and mass and what have you, and the very subtle software algorithms to make sure that the robot behaves as if you're holding the instruments in your hand. And this is truly amazing, and testament to the team that they have achieved that, to give that natural feel, but it is far from trivial.
Absolutely. And one thing that you mentioned is the engineering in that, and that's what I'm going to pick out, because I want to bring up being a Dutch company and how being in the Netherlands ecosystem supports the businesses, because as far as I can see, there's some quite big VC that is sovereign wealth funds that put a lot of money into the early stages of the companies and helps them along the way. There's engineering talent that comes out of Philips, is the big company out of there. So is everything great coming from the Netherlands, or like what are the challenges also of being a business based in the Netherlands?
No, I think the area where we're in, Eindhoven, is fantastic for the high-end mechatronics that I was talking about. There's a lot of competency, a lot of companies there indeed, with the Philips heritage or otherwise, ASML, you name it. So there is really a very good ecosystem of companies. There's a lot of trust, actually. It's a really high trust ecosystem, which means that, yes, of course, you need contracts, but you don't need, let's say, very thick contracts to get going and learn from each other and collaborate. So that's one. Second of all, the talent is there. And I am very proud that the team we have, engineers and otherwise, they really buy into the mission. I'll give you one example actually from that UV light therapy. My times there, I still remember, it takes a few years to develop this whole device from scratch and then get it certified and blah, blah, blah. But I remember very well, at one point I was talking to a woman. She was a patient with eczema, and she had used our device. And I talked to her and said, how is it? And she said, Iwan, for the first time in 10 years, I don't have any itch anymore. Do you know what that means? And still today, when I tell that story, I can feel, my skin crawling, so to speak,
Yeah.
right? And that's the impact we can have, right? And when you talk about a mission in health, we're doing it for the patients. And just talking to one patient, where with your help, with your device, you can make such a difference. That is amazing. So we have that mission, we have the ecosystem, we have the talent. Now, is everything perfect in Holland? No. What I would wish is to have, let's say, the ambition and also the risk appetite, frankly, let's say that typically American investors would have. Because I'm convinced if we were based in the US, we'd be going faster, we'd be, with all respect, we'd have more resources. I'm very proud of what we did, but we've frankly done it on a dime. And that is a huge achievement. But I think we're ready to go to the next phase and scale up and really start playing with the big boys.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point, is the US versus the European, because I think that's not just a Dutch thing, that is a whole European system versus the US. You're trying to raise money in Europe and they will say your valuation is way too high, we could never go to that. You go to the US and they say it's not big enough for us to get involved at that valuation. So it's such an interesting perspective, and one that I think a lot of founders, CEOs, having challenges with at the moment. So bringing it onto the investment round, you're obviously in London because it's the LSI conference. So you guys are on the raising journey at the minute. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about what the funding is going to be enabled you to do, and also a little bit more about how you want that round to look?
Yes. So indeed, we're raising the Series C, and this C round will give us three key deliverables. One is the CE mark next year, as well as the FDA clearance also next year, and the first commercial traction. Because, when all is said and done, the single biggest validation proof point that you're making something that the world is waiting for is a willing paying customer. So once you have evidence of that, you've crossed a major bridge. So all of that will be part of the next C round. So we're very excited to make that next step. We'll do the rollout first in a few European countries, of course, a controlled launch, followed shortly thereafter with a controlled customer launch in the US. And of course, then you get into the growth phase that attracts a different set of investors, requires a different organization. We will need, of course, a US organization to build that. All very exciting. None of it is cheap, but this is really the next phase of the company, and I'm really looking forward to that.
So obviously we talked a little bit earlier about the competitive nature of surgical robotics and the microsurgical space. So we will mention the name is MMI. They've got to market in Europe and they're also commercializing in the US right now. So I want to talk about the dynamics of being either first to market or a fast follower to market. Do you guys see it as an advantage to be following someone else blazing the trail and going first, or do you see it as you'd like to have been in that position, but...
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. Obviously, being the first to market is an advantage. Everything else being equal, right? Now we were first to market with the MUSA 2, but we're not anymore, so to speak. So that is definitely true. At the same time, you see, and you alluded to it, there's still a whole market to be developed for microsurgical robotics, and having more players working to develop that market is a good thing. And I think in general, customers want to have choice, right? If they only have one choice, they typically don't like it. So I think there's plenty of room for more than one player. One of the benefits is that by being a follower, you can literally build on the regulatory clearance path that the competitor has cleared. So we will benefit from that, having an expedited route to market. That's obviously one of the advantages. And at the end of the day, you compete. The customers, different customers will have different preferences and what have you. And I think, that we can succeed, but so can others. And there's plenty of room in the inn, so to speak.
So yeah, we're going to follow on the Pulsify Medical piece, so cardiac monitoring, and just talk us through the story of how that opportunity came about and what the journey was that you went on there.
Yes, so that was actually the third out of the four medtech ventures that I've been in. I've done that for several years, and that was also an adventure, because one of my favorite saying is a venture is first and foremost an adventure, and that means ups and downs. And I've experienced that in the various ventures in the past. We all know the statistics in venturing, and certainly in medtech. More companies don't succeed or die ultimately than succeed, right? Let's be honest. And when you start a venture, you believe in a proposition. You do that with a great team of believers in the mission and what have you. But I know from personal experience, it is very hard, and a lot of companies fail. So yeah, indeed, with Pulsify Medical, this is all, again, in hindsight, right? You learn as you go, but it was a deep semiconductor innovation, a new process technology in semiconductors, which, for those who are not so familiar with, is a big deal. It's a multi-year, very expensive trajectory to develop and validate, etc. Basically, a new fabrication technology to make, in this case, an ultrasound sensor that was not small but big, say 10 by 10 centimeters, that was flexible, that could be attached to the chest and would continuously monitor your cardiac performance, your cardiac output. That was the vision. But it required major semiconductor innovation. And then on top of that, our mission was to develop a medical device. And the combination of those two things proved too much, frankly. So yeah, after a few years, we couldn't get the investors to make the next step in the European environment, and basically had to call it quits, which was very painful. But yeah, that's what life in medtech venturing is often also about. And I talk to my colleagues, CEOs. It's sometimes it's hard, because you start with a dream. And reality is sometimes tough. But yeah, these ventures that, let's say, didn't succeed, I'm still enormously proud of what we achieved, because that's also one of the motivators. I mentioned patients and what we can do, the impact we can have for them, but just what you can do with a small team of motivated, talented people, fast moving, is fantastic. And there is a reason why a lot of innovation in medtech comes from startup companies, is that startup companies are faster, the better, cheaper, much cheaper than the big corporates, who have 100 times, maybe even 1,000 times more resources. And we as a small company can get things done that the big companies can't. And to do that and to build that team, and to see that drive of people, I'm still very proud of it, of those experiences. I wish, the outcome would have been different, but I have no regrets whatsoever. And also have to be honest, after, let's say, a failure or non-success, it did take me several months to kind of, accept it, grieve, if you like. I don't think that's an exaggeration, and move on. So it is a very personal thing as well. You see the cash runaway, right, reducing every month. There's mouth to feed, colleagues, families, etc. But there's also this dream that you want to realize. And if it turns out that reality is not allowing for this dream, you have to take that decision. But it's not an easy one. And I've had times I said, I'm not going to do this again. I'm just going to get a proper job in a proper company. But then, guess what? A couple months later, something came along my path, and like, you know what? let's do it. And then again, you jump in and hope for the better. And I have no regrets whatsoever. That's what venturing is about.
Awesome. And so you've obviously learned from your failures and it's shaped you as a person. So how has learning from the failures shaped your philosophy basically in personal life, but also in the business world?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, at the end of my first venture, it really touched me deeply. Let's call it the non-success, right? And I did conclude after that in my next venture, yes, I'm going to go full in, but not to the extent that I had gone in the first time around. That was a bit too much, Frank. So it's that fine balance between going all in, but you also have to protect yourself and indeed your colleagues. And so one of the things I also say now to my colleagues, and sometimes they look at me funny, say, if say they're approached by a headhunter or whatever, on LinkedIn, go talk to them. Because you always want to have knowledge of, if this is not going to succeed, what's my fallback option? So that to me is not being unfaithful to the mission. That's being realistic, and that's one of the things I learned, that make sure you have, I don't want to call it a way out, but at least a plan B, because this is a volatile world, and you need to also protect yourself a little bit. That's definitely one of the lessons I learned the hard way.
Absolutely. So obviously the two that come up in microsurgery is MMI and Microsure. Is there anyone else who's chasing this space?
Yeah, that's interesting. So Sony has been public about a device they have developed recently. Also FMED, something similar. From what we can see, they're not market ready. So obviously they might not show the back of their tongue. But from what I can tell, it's a 2-horse race. And so, it's a fairly, let's say, from a competitive point of view, a compact market space. So I think that makes it extra attractive for investors. If you compare that with minimally invasive surgery, that market space is much more competitive. Different suppliers, obviously, again, had the big gorilla Intuitive and then CMR and others. And the dynamics in microsurgery robotics are much more, I'd say, simple. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the points to mention is that there's been an obsession for a number of years about being more and more minimally invasive, but there is a whole market that simply can't be done minimally invasively or laparoscopically, and that's the open procedures, and robotics can still help there.
Absolutely. And that's what we're all about in Microsure. We're 100% focused on open microsurgery. We're not into the minimally invasive territory at all. I think that's been a brilliant choice, and we're going to stick with that. The market opportunities are plenty, as we discussed. We've got so much to look forward to grow, to build, and making customers happy, really.
Well, that sounds like a great place to end the podcast on. So thanks very much for joining me, Ivan.
It's been a pleasure, Henry. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me on the Crux of MedTech podcast. If you're not already doing so, please go ahead and subscribe on YouTube or follow the podcast on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is proudly brought to you by Crux. Crux is a medtech search firm which places pioneers in transformative roles to help us live longer, healthier lives. We do 3 things for companies. We help hire world-class executive talent. We help companies raise investment from Series A to Series C and execute upon M&A. And we also are building a community of medtech leaders to facilitate peer-to-peer learning and accelerate the companies to help them go faster. If you're interested in any of those 3 things, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or
Follow the link in the show notes to find out more. Thank you.